You sent the message. Then, before they replied, you sent another one, shorter, clarifying something they hadn't questioned yet. Or you were in a conversation, in person, across a table, and you had just finished explaining yourself. They nodded, and something in you read that nod as a prompt to continue, so you said it again, slightly differently, covered the angle you thought you might have missed, added the version 4 if the first one didn't land. They didn't ask for that version. At some point in that sequence, you stopped communicating. You started building a case. I want to talk about what that is, where it came from, and why the people who do it most fluently are usually the ones who were trained earliest, in a house where the terms for being enough were never written down, because they were never meant to be met. Over-explaining is not a communication problem. That's the wrong frame. The person who over-explains is often a precise communicator, attentive to how things land. They notice when you stop following and adjust before you lose the thread. They read shifts in your expression that most people don't catch until it's too late. This is someone who can always find more words, because they learned very early that more words were their best available protection. Protection against what, specifically, is the question worth asking. Developmental psychologists use the phrase conditional regard. Carl Rogers introduced it. The concept is simple. The consequences are not. Conditional regard is what happens when a child receives love, approval, or basic warmth as a function of performance, when the affection depends, when the parent who should be a safe base to return to becomes, structurally, a judge. Not always consciously, not always cruelly, but consistently. You are welcome here when you are enough, and the definition of enough is never quite stable. The child doesn't experience this as a policy. They experience it as the weather, and the child does what any organism does in an unpredictable environment. They become very good at reading the forecast. John Bowlby spent decades mapping what happens to children who can't rely on consistent emotional availability from their caregivers. His finding was this: the child builds what he called an internal working model, a set of operating assumptions about what other people are likely to do, what's required to maintain closeness, and what happens when closeness fails. The child with a secure base builds a model that says connection is stable, and I can move through the world and return to it. The child who learned that connection was conditional builds something different, something that says connection must be maintained, monitored, earned in real time. That second model doesn't expire when the child leaves the house. It runs under everything, in every room where the approval of another person matters. And most rooms qualify. Here's what the over-explanation looks like from the inside, because this is where it gets precise. It doesn't feel like insecurity. The person doing it rarely experiences it as desperate. It feels like thoroughness, like responsibility, like the reasonable precaution of a competent person who understands that ambiguity causes problems. What they are preventing without naming it is the moment where someone pauses and the answer is no. The talking fills the gap before the verdict arrives. And if you keep building the case, keep adding evidence, keep covering the angles you think might be the ones that fail, you can defer that moment almost indefinitely. Jeffrey Young's work on schema therapy identified what he called the defectiveness schema, the core belief, usually installed before the child has the language to question it. There is something wrong with me at the level of what I am, not what I do, and what I do is the only lever I have. The over-explainer is not explaining the situation. They are continuously arguing against that belief in every conversation. To an audience that in most cases isn't even evaluating them, the more interesting question is what happened to the parent. Donald Winnicott introduced the idea of the good enough parent. The concept was precise. The parent doesn't need to be perfect or perfectly attuned. They need to be reliably present enough that the child can develop a stable sense of themselves without requiring the parent to continuously confirm that they exist correctly. The parent who transmits conditional regard is rarely a monster. They are usually someone who themselves received conditional regard, someone who never developed a secure base and learned as the child does that love is a transaction with unstated terms. They didn't decide to make their child perform for warmth. They passed on the only model of closeness they had. Psychologists call this intergenerational transmission of attachment styles. The pattern doesn't require cruelty. It only requires that the person who was never enough raises a child in a house where enough was never clearly defined. What the child builds in that house is a skill, and this is the part that complicates the clean story about wound and damage. The child who needed to read the room to maintain closeness becomes an extraordinarily good reader of rooms. They calibrate language in real time. They monitor reactions before the reaction is finished. They adjust their approach mid-sentence based on information most people don't know how to use. This is expertise, purchased at significant cost, but expertise. The problem is what it makes impossible. Because here's what the over-explainer cannot know, even when everything goes well. When someone accepts what they've said, when the approval arrives, when the affirmation lands, they can't verify what was accepted. Was it the argument, the evidence, the well-constructed case they spent the last several minutes assembling, or was it them? That distinction is impossible to collapse when what's always being offered is the performance. The person who wins every room never gets to know whether the room would have taken them without the winning. Dan McAdams has spent decades studying narrative identity, the story people build about who they are and why their life means what it means. His work shows that the coherence of that story depends on being witnessed, on being reflected back by another person. The over-explainer is being witnessed constantly, but what gets reflected back is the case, the competence, the structure of the argument, the person underneath, who never stopped needing to know they were enough before the argument started, rarely gets to find out. There is a particular shape this takes in adult relationships that is worth naming carefully. Someone gets close enough that the over-explanation would be strange because intimacy is supposed to mean you don't have to earn the room, it's already yours, and something in the over-explainer doesn't know how to operate in that condition. They keep making the case. In a room that's already theirs, their partner says, "You don't have to explain yourself to me," and the over-explainer hears it, believes it intellectually, then explains themselves again. Because the absence of the trial feels like a trap. Because if no one is evaluating them, how do they confirm they're still there? The nervous system built for an environment where love required performance doesn't know what to do with love that doesn't. It keeps waiting for the terms to appear. It scans for the clause that was missed. And when the clause never comes, it writes one in. Brené Brown's research on shame kept arriving at the same finding from different angles. Shame is the fear of disconnection, the belief that there is something about you that, if seen, would cost you the relationship. The over-explainer has found a sophisticated solution to that fear. They ensure that nothing is ever fully seen. Every conversation is curated. Every self-disclosure is pre-packaged. The case is always built before the jury convenes. What doesn't get protected in that arrangement is the thing that was supposed to be protected, because the version of you that survives the scrutiny is always the version you prepared. The unedited one, the one that might actually be worth knowing, stays back. I want to ask you something before this ends. Think about the last conversation where you explained yourself more than the situation required, where you kept going past the point where it was about information, past the point where the other person needed anything more. What were you arguing? Because underneath the specific claim, underneath the defense of whatever particular thing you were saying, there was probably a second argument running, quieter, more fundamental. The one you never actually finish. The one that's been running since long before this conversation, in the voice of a room you no longer live in front of a person who stopped being your audience years ago. The child who was never enough doesn't stop being that child because they got older. They stop when something interrupts the model. When someone offers consistent regard without conditions long enough that the nervous system begins, slowly and with considerable resistance, to update. That process is not quick, and it requires something the over-explainer has spent a lifetime avoiding, saying something incomplete, leaving a gap, letting the answer come back without filling the space first, sitting in the silence between what you offered and what returns without adding anything. Because that silence, the one you have been filling your whole life, is the exact place where the answer to the actual question lives. Whether you're enough before the argument starts. You have been making the case for so long that you may not remember there was ever a question underneath it. There was. And the fact that you never let it breathe doesn't mean it stopped waiting for an answer.